Dream Psychology, Chapter 3, Mental Background. There is a method of looking at personality adopted instinctively by all people. The storyteller, the talker, the speaker, the witness, anybody, in fact, who dominates the moment, is regarded by the most innocent spectator from two absolutely distinct points of view. What he says and what he remembers and adds as time passes form one train of interest, but the way he speaks forms another and quite independent train of interest. The witness is quite conscious of what he says, but he is only partly conscious or unconscious of the way he says it. The practical value of this lies in the fact that although people know that he may be unconscious and readily accept the idea, yet his unconscious gestures and mannerisms are regarded as being of as much importance as the stream of words issuing from his mouth. It is not perhaps too much to say that often they are regarded as far greater importance. What hearing has this on mental background? It means that there is a natural tendency for people to look behind the conscious levels and conscious processes for the whole understanding of a man's actions. The eye instinctively focuses itself as much on mental background as on mental foreground, and in looking at mental background, it sees some kind of activity at work that either corroborates or gives a denial to the processes occurring on mental foreground. How does this activity reveal itself? It reveals itself in a great number of small ways, in a language that is difficult to describe and yet unmistakable in its meaning. It is a very curious, minute language of gestures, hesitations, attitudes, and changes in color, voice, tone, and expression. It is a language that shines through speech itself. It is read by the kinds of words used, by the emphasis of the reiterations or avoidances. It is a language that speaks in many other ways, some of which escape the power of words. Its peculiarity is that it's understood by all human beings, and apparently to a greater or less extent by animals. The more finished a statesman or diplomatist or a man of the world is, the less easily can the language be read. It is not the language of conscious gesture. It is the language of unconscious gesture. Perhaps it is the channel most used in forming opinions of other people, and particularly it is the source of first impressions. Now this language, unconscious to the speaker, is read by the listener unconsciously. Later on, by careful thinking, some of its symbolism may be brought into consciousness, examined, and given an explanation. But that is not a common experiment because it seems unnecessary. I have used the term symbolism in describing this language. In this connection, a symbol can be defined as latent meaning. Its meaning is latent only in relationship to the intellect because it appeals immediately to general intelligence. It is understood apart from the intellect. When the intellect is brought to hear on it, I believe that word is supposed to be to bear on it. When the intellect is brought to bear on it, it requires to be unpicked and spread out. It is thus condensed as well as latent meaning. The language of unconscious gesture is a language of condensed and latent meaning, but though condensed and latent, its effect is very powerful. Let us take an example as an illustration. A man is called upon to propose somebody's health at a public dinner. He makes a very adulatory speech and then he lifts his glass. His gesture is only partial. He raises his glass slowly a little way off the table and announces the toast. His action at once suggests a meaning. In spite of his words, his enthusiasm is reluctant. The action at once flashes this meaning into everyone present. That meaning is grasped long before any conscious reasoning comes into play. It may be designed, that is, always a possibility, but it may be quite unconscious. The man may clumsily upset his glass at the moment the toast comes. The action produces a sense of awkwardness. Something has occurred that contradicts the outward spirit of the proceedings. It arouses a kind of suspicion, or, to quote an actual occurrence, after an extremely friendly speech, the man raises an empty glass instead of a glass of wine. He discovers his mistake and apologized. Now the mistake and the apology left behind a curious flavor. The man's actions belied his words. That is a common phrase, but it sums up the position accurately. All these gestures are symbolisms. They are eloquent in themselves, but they convey meaning that is latent and condensed, or, to use a better term, they contain unfocused meaning. If they are brought up into full conscious examination, they are capable of interpretation. Interpretation is the handling of symbolism by the intellect. It is here that differences arise, because every man interprets with some bias, which may be momentary or permanent in one direction or another. A friend will interpret the wine glass symbolism in a different manner from an enemy. A believer in the future of humanity will interpret the sign of the times, which are symbolisms with prospective meaning, in a happier light than a believer in ancient tradition who sees the golden age in the past. Now these disparities are fundamental and are encountered whenever symbolism is under discussion. Focused meaning covers a certain area which is reality. A bottle of ink or a lamp or a jackal are things with certain clear circle of focused meaning within which no argument occurs, but the expression of a face, the configuration of the stars, a poem, or a dream are things that contain no clear circle of focused meaning. Their meaning is blurred or unfocused. They are capable of various interpretations, and therefore tend to belong to symbolisms rather than realities. Naturally, if realities, that is, things with focused meaning, are interrogated far enough, they lose their definition and pass into symbols. If you pass out of the clear circle of focused meaning, you pass into symbolism. The reverse process, the passing from latent and blurred to clear and focused meaning, has been the main trend of mental development recently and has made modern science and the machine age possible. In this way, it becomes possible to recognize in some degree the relativity of symbolism, and the recognition is important because it has become a preoccupation of some people to attempt to draw a sharp line of division between symbols and realities. At the same time, it's possible to see how interpretation, or the process of focusing in consciousness, some of the meaning latent in symbolism is influenced by the personal considerations. No one, for example, supposes that a Jew looks on the symbol of the cross in the same way as a Christian, or that, in approaching symbolism in general, he will ever see eye to eye with a man who is not a Jew. Differences in mental background must degrade or refine the interpretation. A man who is lacking in some typical human experience will never interpret in quite the same way as a man who is richer by it. Now, we have so far considered mental background in two aspects. In one, it seems responsible for a certain language, which we have called the language of unconscious gesture. This is a language of symbolism. In the other, it is responsible for differences in the interpretation of these symbols and symbols in general. Excuse me. What bearing has all this upon dreams in the study of the neurotic? It bears upon the problem of the neurotic directly because the neurosis is a creation of the mind, like the dream. It is something which arises spontaneously, without apparent organic causes. A man may suffer from morbid fear. This is a kind of emotional neurosis. His fear fastens on this or that beyond his control. Or he may have a strange, dominant impulse to do something grotesque that is quite out of the tenor of his normal life. This is a kind of ideational neurosis. It is some uncontrolled force in himself fastening on a bad or primitive idea. Or he may have some loss of function, a palsy, or a loss of sensation, or an inability to act, or think, or feel that is beyond remedy by conscious control. This is a kind of function neurosis. It cripples efficiency. One can say that the neurosis always cripples efficiency, and efficiency is not to be measured in terms of action alone. It must include the power of thought and feeling and instinct. It may mean nothing but a loss of power of enjoyment, but this is a loss of efficiency as much as a paralysis affecting a leg or an arm, or a cramp affecting a hand. A man cannot sit down and manufacture a neurosis for himself straight away by taking thought. He cannot produce a functional paralysis by thinking of it. The neurosis shapes itself. It reveals itself as something beyond the region of conscious activity. Its growth is undetected, and its appearance, like the dream, may be one of dramatic suddenness, or it may distract attention gradually with a certain subtlety, vanishing for considerable periods and then reappearing with fuller insistence, in the same way as some dreams gradually shape themselves night after night in a certain direction. It distracts attention as something coming in upon the conscious field from without, something puzzling and unthought of. From what region does it come? It must come out of mental background. The neurosis then can be regarded as a creation of mental background. This does not mean that mental foreground or consciousness has nothing to do with formation. We have seen that mental background can be looked on as being responsible for the minute language of unconscious gesture, which may contradict the processes occurring in full consciousness. The operations of mental background are affected by the operations of mental foreground. If, then, the neurosis is a creation of mental background, it does not follow that what is occurring in mental foreground never has anything to do with its production. Mental foreground, by causing mental background to react in certain ways, might theoretically be wholly responsible for the creation of the neurosis, but the responsibility would not be a direct one. The matter can be put into simple allegory. If a stern master quite unwittingly starves a servant, and by reason of this wretched state, the servant commits an act of violence and robbery, how do we look on the master? As with the neurotic, one feels in his presence a sense of bafflement. Who is responsible? The act of violence, like the neurosis, has a complex origin, and one does not know where to put the blame. It is a triangular problem. The problem of the neurotic is also triangular, and it can be compared to the problem of the master, the servant, and the act of violence. At one angle, it is a fact of neurosis, a functional paralysis of the legs, let us say, and this can be likened to an act of violence. There is, at another angle, the statement of the case, the patient's history and explanations as given by himself, and this is the point of view of the uncomprehending master. At the third angle is the statement of the servant, and this will not coincide with the master's account. It will contain much that the master was unconscious of and incapable of realizing. What is comparable to the statement of the servant in the problem of the neurotic? When the physician listens to the account of the patient's illness, he has, like everyone else, 2 points of view. What the patient says forms one train of evidence. The manner in which he says it forms another. In other words, the language of unconscious gesture gives him certain clues that the conscious estimate of the patient does not give. The patient says, for example, that he is by nature calm, good-tempered, and broad-minded. Certain hasty gestures, facial contradictions, and movements of the eyes and phrases contradict that statement. The patient is unconscious of them. Now, all this can be compared to the statement of the servant who, owing to his master's ignorance, has been starved and finally driven to an act of violence. It lies outside the consciousness, the master's estimate. It belongs, so far as the patient is concerned, to the unconscious, but it does not belong to the unconscious in a static or negative sense, but in a dynamic and positive sense. It is an independent activity of which the patient is unaware. It is unconscious activity. The language of unconscious gesture is not the only indication of this activity. The man who takes up a pencil in a fit of abstraction and finds some time later that he has drawn a curious pattern which seems meaningless is influenced by it. It is only a step from this to automatic writing in which the activities of the unconscious are led out in a definite direction or through a particular cerebral mechanism. The post-hypnotic states afford illustrations of how a suggestion planted under conditions that are not those of normal consciousness affects the trend of interest in a manner that is somewhat comparable to the compulsion, neurosis, and also some of the vagaries of memory. A person, while under hypnosis, is given the suggestion that 5 minutes after he wakes up, he will sneeze. He is aroused, and 5 minutes later, the peculiar accuracy with which the lapse of time is calculated does not belong to conscious estimation. His face is contorted and he sneezes. He may not always sneeze. The initial contortion may only show itself, in which case compulsion is replaced by tendency. Now, no one can make himself sneeze without some external or suitable stimulus and a suggestion to that effect, given under normal circumstances, has no result. The sudden appearance of the impulse to sneeze, which arises, so far as the patient is concerned, apparently spontaneously, and, as the physician knows, without organic cause, is comparable to the sudden appearance in consciousness of the imperative idea or of forgotten events. The movements of memory constantly suggest the influence of activities beyond consciousness and the control of memory, like the control of the act of sneezing, does not belong wholly to the conscious mind, but the particular product that demands some theory of unconscious activity for its explanation, and the one that concerns us here is the dream, for it is by study of this typical form of unconscious elaboration that certain problems of the neurotic become apparent. Of what value is the dream when the problem of the neurotic is under consideration? The value of the dream lies in the fact that it is a typical product related to the angle or aspect of the problem of the neurotic, which has been compared to the statement of the servant. So far, we have seen that the language of unconscious gesture can be regarded as parallel to the servant's case in the problem of the master-servant and the act of violence. This angle, the angle of unconscious activity in the neurotic's problem, cannot be approached directly. If the comparison is extended, let us suppose the servant were dumb and also illiterate. In that case, he would give his evidence by gestures, and if he were something of an artist, he might draw pictures as well to make his case clearer. Now, these pictures would correspond to the dreams that are thrown up on the screen of the screen of perception during sleep. The fact that these pictures were at first sight meaningless or only vaguely suggestive would not necessarily detract from anything of value. A hasty observer might throw them aside after a first glance, but that would arise out of a disinclination to take the trouble to find out if the illiterate artist were not drawing after a special fashion of his own. Moreover, if some complicated statement had to be shown pictorially, the artist might be driven to employ a complicated method which would require a great deal of patient elucidation. In other words, he might have to draw a complicated cartoon, the interpretation of which might be a matter of great difficulty. The dream, then, may contain valuable material, and, like the servant's cartoon, it may have behind it a definite motive. And that concludes Chapter 3. Chapter 4 is entitled Dreams and Cartoons. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please like and subscribe, and till soon.